The first bell of the morning rang sharply through the halls of Jefferson High School, sending a rush of students into classrooms. Lockers slammed shut, sneakers squeaked on the linoleum floor, and voices overlapped in a chaotic morning chorus. Inside room 214, the smell of dry erase markers and floor cleaner hung in the air. The desks were arranged in neat rows facing the whiteboard, where Mrs. Carter, a woman in her late 40s with carefully styled blonde hair and a crisp navy cardigan, was organizing her lesson notes. One by one, students took their seats, pulling out spiral notebooks and Chromebooks. Conversations dwindled to murmurs. Mrs. Carter, a stickler for punctuality and engagement, prided herself on keeping a tight classroom. At the back, by the window, Malik Johnson slipped into his chair. He was tall for 15, with warm brown skin, short cropped hair, and a quiet demeanor that made him blend into the background most days. Today, however, he didn't even pretend to open his notebook. He sat down heavily, exhaled, and let his head droop forward until his forehead nearly touched the desk. Mrs. Carter noticed him almost immediately. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she clicked the cap back on her marker. "All right, class," she began, her voice brisk. "Today we're continuing our unit on Of Mice and Men. Please open to Chapter 5 and—" Her gaze swept the room again, landing on Malik. His eyes were closed. His shoulders rose and fell in slow, heavy breaths. She frowned. Really? At 8:05 in the morning? Mrs. Carter had seen plenty of students try to sleep through her class over the years, but something about it always rubbed her the wrong way, as if it were a personal challenge to her authority. She knew that if she let one student get away with it, others would follow. "Mr. Johnson," she said sharply, the sound of his name slicing through the quiet room. A few heads turned toward the back row. Malik stirred but didn't sit up right away. His eyelids fluttered open halfway, revealing tired, bloodshot eyes. Mrs. Carter took a step closer. "This is not nap time," she said, her tone edged with irritation. "I wasn't—" Malik began, his voice low and hoarse. "Don't start," she interrupted. "You're in my classroom during my lesson, and you have your head down. That's unacceptable." Some students smirked behind their hands. Others looked away awkwardly. Malik straightened slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm just tired," he muttered. Mrs. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then perhaps you should have gone to bed at a reasonable hour instead of staying up playing video games or scrolling on your phone." A few soft chuckles rippled through the class. Malik's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. His eyes dropped back toward his desk. "That's it," Mrs. Carter said, reaching for the small stack of detention slips on her desk. She scribbled his name in quick, sharp strokes, tore the paper from the pad, and walked it over to his desk. "You can report to detention after school. Maybe you'll find the energy to stay awake tomorrow." Malik took the slip without looking at her, folding it in half and sliding it into his notebook. His expression was unreadable, but his shoulders seemed to sag just a little more. Mrs. Carter turned back to the front of the room, convinced she had made her point. To her, it was just another instance of enforcing discipline. But for Malik, it was the second time in 24 hours someone had assumed the worst without asking a single question. The rest of the morning dragged by in slow, uneasy stretches. Malik sat through 2 more classes, his mind swimming in a haze of exhaustion. Every time a teacher began speaking, his focus slipped, and his eyelids threatened to close. He fought it, but the ache behind his eyes was relentless. By the time the lunch bell rang, he was shuffling down the hall with his hood pulled halfway up, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Conversations buzzed all around him. Laughter, gossip, the clatter of lockers. But it all felt muffled, distant. Unfortunately, Mrs. Carter hadn't forgotten their encounter that morning. As Malik passed her classroom on his way toward the cafeteria, she stepped into the hallway, holding a stack of graded essays. She caught sight of him and called out, "Mr. Johnson, a word, please." He paused reluctantly, the noise of the hallway washing over them. Mrs. Carter crossed her arms, the papers tucked under one elbow. "I hope you've used the rest of your morning to reflect on your behavior earlier," she said, loud enough for a couple of nearby students to overhear. Malik glanced down at the floor. "I wasn't trying to be disrespectful." Her voice sharpened. "Sleeping in my class is disrespectful. It sends a message that you don't care about your education or about the effort I put into teaching." A couple of students lingered nearby, pretending to fiddle with their phones while they listened. Malik's face warmed under their curious stares. "I wasn't sleeping on purpose," he said quietly. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. "Don't make excuses. You've been here long enough to know the rules. Everyone else manages to stay awake, so why can't you?" That last sentence hung in the air, like a challenge. Malik's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. He could feel the heat rising in his chest. Not from guilt, but from the weight of being judged when she didn't know a single thing about his night. When he didn't respond, Mrs. Carter shook her head. "Fine. We'll discuss it further with the detention supervisor this afternoon. Maybe a quiet room will give you time to think about your priorities." With that, she turned back into her classroom. As Malik started toward the cafeteria again, he heard a whisper from one of the eavesdropping students. "Man, she's on your case today." He didn't answer. He didn't have the energy. Instead, he headed for an empty corner table in the cafeteria, unwrapped a sandwich he barely tasted, and counted the hours until the end of the day, and until detention, which was now inevitable. For the rest of the afternoon, the tension from that hallway exchange clung to him like smoke, trailing him from class to class. By the final bell, Malik felt like the day had been one long spotlight on his worst moment. And the worst part? Nobody knew the truth. The last bell of the day echoed through the hallways, and most students burst out of classrooms like water from a dam, laughing, talking, eager to escape the building. The air was filled with the sound of slamming lockers and sneakers squeaking toward the exits. But Malik wasn't heading for freedom. He moved slowly, his backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder, until he reached the door at the far end of the hall marked Room 109, Detention. The door was old, the paint around the handle chipped from years of use. Inside, the room smelled faintly of pencil shavings and stale air. A single row of overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. 10 desks sat in a loose formation, each spaced widely apart. Only 3 students were already there. 2 quietly scrolling on their phones under the desk, one staring blankly at a textbook. At the front sat Mr. Phillips, the detention supervisor, a wiry man in his 50s with reading glasses perched on his nose. He barely looked up from the stack of crossword puzzles in front of him as Malik stepped in. "Name?" Mr. Phillips asked without warmth. "Malik Johnson," he said, his voice low. Mr. Phillips glanced at a clipboard, nodded toward the middle row. "Sit anywhere. No talking, no electronics." Malik slid into a desk near the back. His body felt heavy, like every movement was a small chore. He pulled out the detention slip Mrs. Carter had given him, smoothed it on the desk, and stared at the neatly printed letters of his name. The room was quiet except for the occasional shuffle of paper and the faint hum of the lights. Outside the window, the sky was shifting toward late afternoon, the sun slanting in long golden beams. Malik tried to focus on the worksheet Mr. Phillips handed him, a generic reflection form, asking why he was in detention, what rule he had broken, and how he could make better choices in the future. He filled in the first line slowly, his handwriting more sluggish than usual. Halfway through the second question, his head began to dip forward. He caught himself just in time, blinking hard. His eyes burned, and a dull ache throbbed in the back of his skull. Mr. Phillips looked up, squinting. "Johnson, you okay back there?" Malik nodded quickly, sitting straighter. "Yeah, just tired." The older man studied him for a moment longer. Malik wasn't fidgeting like a bored student. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost like his body was trying to conserve energy. But Mr. Phillips said nothing more, simply lowering his eyes back to the crossword. The minutes crawled by. Malik's gaze drifted to the window, watching a pair of birds hop along the low branch of a tree outside. His mind felt foggy, detached from the quiet scrape of pencils and the occasional cough. By the time Mr. Phillips announced, "All right, you can go," the clock read 4:15. Malik gathered his things slowly, his muscles stiff. As he left the room, he could feel Mr. Phillips's eyes on him again. Not in suspicion, but in a way that suggested the older man had noticed something was off. Still, no one asked, and Malik wasn't ready to tell. The hallway outside the detention room was eerily quiet. Most of the school had emptied out long ago, and the only sounds were the distant thud of a locker being shut and the soft squeak of Malik's sneakers on the polished linoleum. He walked slowly, his backpack dragging down one shoulder. The straps creaked faintly with each step. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows, pooling on the floor in golden rectangles that Malik stepped through like he was wading across shallow water. His mind was fogged with exhaustion. Each footstep felt heavier than the last. His head throbbed faintly, and there was a slight sting in his eyes every time he blinked. That's when Ms. Ramirez, the school counselor, stepped out of her office near the main entrance. She was in her late 30s, with warm brown skin, dark hair pulled into a bun, and a cardigan draped over her shoulders. She was locking the office door when she spotted Malik. Her brow furrowed instantly. "Malik?" she called gently. He stopped and glanced up, his eyes dull with fatigue. "Oh, hey, Ms. Ramirez." She walked toward him, her heels making soft clicks on the floor. "You look like you're about to fall over," she said, scanning his posture. "Are you okay?" Malik gave a small shrug. "Yeah, just tired." "That's the second time today someone's told me they're just tired," she said, tilting her head. "And in my experience, it's almost never just that." He tried to smile, but it came out weak. "It's fine." "Sit," she said, nodding toward a bench against the wall. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it had the sort of authority that made it hard to refuse. Malik sank down onto the bench, setting his backpack on the floor with a soft thump. Ms. Ramirez sat beside him, angling her body so she could see his face. "So," she began softly, "did something happen last night?" He stared at the floor for a long moment. The memory of the night before, and the choking smell of smoke, the orange glow in the darkness, the sound of glass breaking, pressed at the edges of his mind. He wasn't sure he wanted to talk about it. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready," she added, "but I can't help if I don't know what's going on." Her voice was calm, patient, not demanding like Mrs. Carter's earlier. Finally, Malik let out a slow breath. "I didn't sleep much." "How much?" she asked. "Maybe 2 hours," he admitted. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. 2 hours? That's not just tired, Malik. Why? He hesitated again, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "There was a fire." Ms. Ramirez straightened. "A fire? Where?" "My neighborhood," Malik said, his eyes still fixed on the floor. "The house across the street. I saw it when I got up to get water." "And?" she prompted gently. He swallowed hard. "There was a little girl in there. She was screaming from the upstairs window. Her parents weren't home. I went in." Ms. Ramirez's breath caught. "You went inside?" Malik nodded slowly, got her out through the back door before the fire trucks came. For a moment, the hallway was completely silent, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Ms. Ramirez's voice softened further. "Malik, you saved her life." He shrugged, looking away. "I just couldn't let her die." She studied him for another moment, her expression shifting from concern to something like awe. "Does Mrs. Carter know about this?" "No," Malik said quickly, "and I don't want her to, or anyone else." Ms. Ramirez shook her head. "I'm sorry, but something like this can't stay quiet forever." She stood up, her voice still gentle but decisive. "Stay here a moment." As she walked back toward her office, Malik leaned against the wall, feeling an odd mix of relief and dread. Someone finally knew the truth, but he had no idea what that was going to mean. By the time Malik got home that evening, the late sun was dipping low behind the rooftops, bathing the street in a warm orange glow. His apartment building was quiet, but he could still see the blackened shell of the house across the street. Windows boarded, smoke stains crawling up the siding. The smell of char lingered faintly in the air. Upstairs, in her office at Jefferson High, Ms. Ramirez sat at her desk with her phone in hand, staring at the keypad for a long moment before dialing. She wasn't one to rush to conclusions, but the weight in Malik's voice earlier told her this was no story for attention. She needed confirmation. The line clicked. "City Fire Department, Station 3, a man's voice answered. "This is Laura Ramirez, school counselor at Jefferson High. I'm trying to confirm details about a house fire last night on..." She gave the address. "I believe one of my students was involved in a rescue there." There was a pause on the other end, then a low whistle. "You're talking about the kid who pulled that little girl out?" "Yeah, we know him. Brave as hell. Ms. Ramirez sat up straighter. So it's true. Absolutely, the firefighter said. When we arrived, he'd already gotten her out to safety. She was coughing, but stable. If he hadn't acted when he did, we might be talking about a very different outcome. Ms. Ramirez's chest tightened. Thank you, she said quietly, ending the call. She pulled up her email and quickly typed a short note to Principal Evans, marking it urgent. The subject line was simple: Hero in our hallways. By the next morning, the ripple had started. Principal Evans called Mrs. Carter into his office before first period. He was a tall man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. But today there was a spark of excitement in his eyes. Do you know what Malik Johnson did last night? He asked. Mrs. Carter frowned. Aside from showing up to school too tired to keep his eyes open, he slid a printout across the desk, a local news alert from the station's website. The headline read, Teenager saves neighbor's child from blazing house fire. Her eyes flicked down the page. There was no photo of Malik yet, but the details matched exactly what she'd heard from Ms. Ramirez earlier in the staff lounge. The fire, the rescue, the child's safe recovery. He risked his life, Evans said. We're contacting the family today. I'm thinking we hold a small assembly. Let the school know what kind of courage this young man has. Mrs. Carter's cheeks grew warm. She remembered the sound of her own voice yesterday, clipped and sharp, accusing him of laziness in front of the whole class. She swallowed hard. I had no idea. Evans's gaze softened slightly. No one did, but maybe now we'll start asking more questions before we jump to conclusions. By mid-morning, the whispers were already making their way down the hallways. I heard Malik pulled a kid out of a burning house. No way. Ms. Ramirez told Principal Evans, it's true. Students who usually ignored him in the cafeteria were now turning to watch as he walked past. Malik noticed the stares, but didn't understand the reason. Not yet. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter sat at her desk between classes, staring at the detention slips stacked neatly in front of her. The one with Malik's name on it felt heavier than paper should. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the authority in the room. The school day rolled on, but Mrs. Carter found it impossible to focus. Her lectures felt mechanical, her voice going through the motions, while her thoughts kept looping back to the same image. Malik sitting in the back row, his head resting on his desk, eyes half shut with exhaustion, and her standing over him, misreading everything. During her free period, she sat alone in the quiet classroom. The walls, lined with neatly laminated posters about literature and grammar, seemed to press in on her. On her desk sat the printed article Principal Evans had shown her, now creased from how often she'd picked it up, read a few lines, and put it down again. The words were simple but devastating. A 15-year-old local student rescued a 7-year-old girl from a burning home late Tuesday night. The teen entered the home before firefighters arrived, locating the child upstairs and carrying her to safety through the back door. Witnesses say the boy's quick action likely saved her life. She pictured Malik, tall but still so young, navigating smoke-filled rooms, hearing the roar of flames and the shriek of alarms. How terrified he must have been. How tired he must have felt afterward. And yet, instead of being met with gratitude or even curiosity, he had been met with her suspicion and scolding. Mrs. Carter set the paper down and rubbed her temples. I didn't ask him once if he was all right. I didn't even wonder why his eyes were bloodshot. Her mind replayed the hallway confrontation, the words she'd chosen, video games, excuses, unacceptable, each one sounding harsher now in memory. She felt a twisting in her stomach. She prided herself on being fair, on treating her students equally. But the truth was, she had looked at Malik that morning and assumed she already knew the story. She'd been wrong. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Ms. Ramirez, holding a folder under her arm. Got a minute? She asked. Mrs. Carter nodded. I spoke to Malik again this morning, Ms. Ramirez said, stepping inside. He still doesn't want a lot of attention, but the principal's insisting on recognizing him. You should probably talk to him before the assembly. Mrs. Carter looked down, ashamed. I owe him an apology, a real one. Ms. Ramirez studied her face for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good. He deserves that. After Ms. Ramirez left, Mrs. Carter sat for a long while, staring at the detention slip with Malik's name on it. She picked it up, ran her thumb over the folded edge, then tore it neatly in half, the sound loud in the empty room. She knew an apology wouldn't erase the sting of yesterday's public reprimand. But maybe it could be a start, if she could find the right words and the humility to say them. As the last bell of the day approached, Mrs. Carter rehearsed the conversation in her head. This time, she wouldn't speak like a teacher correcting a student. She'd speak like a human being who had been wrong. The morning of the assembly, the gymnasium was buzzing long before the bell rang. Folding chairs had been set up in neat rows across the polished hardwood floor, the Jefferson High banner hanging high above the stage. Students filed in, chattering with the restless energy of people who knew they were about to miss a class period. Near the back doors, Malik stood awkwardly with Ms. Ramirez, shifting from foot to foot. He wore clean jeans and a dark hoodie, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His expression was guarded. He didn't entirely understand why the whole school needed to be here. Before the program began, Mrs. Carter approached from the side aisle, her steps hesitant. She stopped a few feet from him. "Malik," she said softly. He looked up, wary. "Yeah." For a moment, she searched for the right words. "I wanted to say, I was wrong. Yesterday morning, I assumed things about you without asking. I didn't listen, and I treated you unfairly in front of everyone. I'm sorry." Malik studied her for a moment, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "It's okay," he said automatically, though it was clear he hadn't expected the apology. "No," she replied gently. "It's not okay. But I hope you'll let me make it right." She gave a faint smile. "You've shown more courage in one night than most of us show in a lifetime." Before he could answer, Principal Evans' voice boomed over the microphone. "All right, everyone, let's take our seats." On the stage, a small table held a bouquet of flowers and a framed certificate. Behind it stood Principal Evans, Ms. Ramirez, and two uniformed firefighters. "Today," Evans began, his voice carrying across the gym, "we honor a student whose bravery and quick thinking saved a life." Late Tuesday night, Malik Johnson noticed a house on fire in his neighborhood. Without hesitation, he entered that home and rescued a young girl trapped inside. A ripple of gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Dozens of students turned in their seats to look at Malik. "He risked his own safety," Evans continued, "and because of his actions, that child is alive today. The Jefferson Fire Department and this community owe him our gratitude." He gestured for Malik to come forward. Malik's heart thudded in his chest as he walked down the center aisle. The gym seemed impossibly large now, every eye following his steps. When he reached the stage, one of the firefighters stepped forward, shaking his hand firmly. "You did good, kid," the man said, his voice low but warm. Principal Evans handed him the certificate, and the applause swelled into a standing ovation. Even the students who barely knew him were on their feet, clapping and cheering. Malik felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he smiled, a small, genuine smile. From the front row, Mrs. Carter stood with the rest, clapping hard, her expression both proud and humbled. When the assembly ended, Malik stepped off the stage into a wave of handshakes, pats on the back, and voices calling his name. It was overwhelming, but in a strange way, it felt lighter than the weight he'd been carrying. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Carter caught his eye again. She mouthed a quiet thank you. For the first time since that exhausting morning, Malik believed she meant it.